All right, looks like the gang's all here. So we will get started. So welcome everyone. This is the role of technology and data in building a sustainable, expanded and inclusive clinical trial network ecosystem panel. I am delighted to have such an esteemed panel of clinical research and development innovators. As we work to operationalize approaches to clinical development that will help us better enable a more equitable representation and increase our understanding of health outcomes for all patients. Your insights on how the advancements of technology, data capture, and analytics can serve to help us achieve those goals is really going to be of great value to our audience. I mean, this has been a thread that we've been hearing throughout our summit to date, so I think it's going to be really interesting and provide a lot of insights to our audience about some of the specifics about how this can actually be accomplished. So I thought, to sort of kick off and level set with the audience, we just sort of go around the horn and have each of you give a brief introduction of yourself and an introduction to your company and organizations. So I'll just look at my screen. Why don't we start with you, Malik, and then we'll continue from there.
Thanks, Carter. Hi, everybody. Malik Mehta, Chief Business Officer with Trinetics. I've been with the company for 5 years and spent more than 20 years in the healthcare industry in general. Trinetics is, we're about an 8-year-old company today. We're a global data and analytics platform. We partner with leading health systems all over the world, 30 plus countries today, to get access to their data. And that data is then presented to mainly the biopharmaceutical and the CRO industry for a variety of different use cases, both on the R&D as well as the post-approval side. So nice to be talking with all of you today.
Thank you, Malik. Matt?
Sure, thanks, Carter. I'm Matt Walls. I'm the CEO of TrialB. TrialB has a platform for matching and enrolling patients into clinical trials. So we help do patient recruitment. We do a lot of large global trials. I think our biggest one is probably close to 20 countries and a couple hundred sites. So real excited to be here today and join the discussion and talk about the topic with such a great panel. Thanks.
Thank you. David?
Hi, this is David Coleman. I'm the CEO of Science 37. Science 37 is an operating system in order to enable decentralized clinical trials. That means we have a technology that manages the workflow, evidence generation, and data harmonization, along with specialty networks, including patient communities and telemedicine investigators, mobile nurses, and remote coordinators, and connected devices, all linked together in order to enable decentralization to happen. Pleased to be here.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Carolyn?
Thank you, Carter. Carolyn McGill, I'm the CEO of Ation. We have a platform that sifts through large amounts of healthcare data, known as real-world data, to assess the safety, effectiveness, and value of medication and clinical treatments. We do this for biopharma manufacturers, large and small, who license the platform or work with our scientists to do things like use data for external control arms or secondary indications or for safety studies once a drug is on the market, as well as for payers and at-risk providers who are looking to ensure they have the right medications and access on their formularies, and then for regulators and HTAs.
Thank you. Thank you. Cindy?
I'm Cindy Hurst, and I head up the division of design and delivery innovation, and that's within IQVIA, our human data science company, where we're leveraging the world's largest healthcare curated data sets, and that's molecule to market and designing smarter, if you will, in accelerated clinical trial design. So pleasure to be with you here today.
Thank you. All right, well, let's dig in. So we just heard from our previous panel about lessons learned from trial delivery during the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the outcomes of what was otherwise, a tragic event was the deployment of tools and technologies that were sort of required out of necessity to continue care for patients and continue clinical research and clinical trials. And that plethora of approaches included use of real-world evidence, advanced analytics, digital and telehealth technologies, which really, I think, accelerated and deepened our understandings of these approaches by pharmaceutical companies, by clinical trial organizations, and by regulators as well. And so, Cindy, maybe let's kick off with you. Can you share with us how IQVIA responded to the COVID-19 vaccine and treatment trial challenges and your point of view of the sustainability of these innovative approaches, especially with regard to enrolling populations most impacted by COVID, and to help us realize a more equitable clinical development ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. Carter, that was quite the mouthful, and really truly exemplified the journey that we were all on, and certainly catalyzed the innovation. And of course, the Holy Grail here, North Star, when regulators are embracing some of this innovation, truly it helped to accelerate the adoption. And as you stated, there was just simply no choice. We had to get on with it. And thankfully, being well prior invested and well prepared, I think that IQVIA in particular, we leverage three major areas of innovation. And the first of which is digitalization and technology. And as you mentioned previously, it was our ability to access and recruit at a breakneck speed and at terrific volumes, and being able to lever decentralized trial technology. And of course, all the while being coupled with leveraging of real world evidence or data, and of course, advanced analytics, and helping us to really target in a precise way this diverse population and others population. And again, at incredible volumes and speed. And for context, just to put some proof points and results behind the power of that triangulation of digital technology, interoperable digital technology, seamless end-to-end for both investigators and patients, coupled with real-world evidence and AI/ML. IQVIA actually played a very pivotal role in collaboration with our sponsors, and were able to recruit nearly 120,000 patients over hundreds of sites across 20 plus countries. And really, that's the power of the interoperability of those three imperatives around the globe. And in terms of sustainability, Carter, again, starting with my initial comments, I think as regulators are embracing and adopting, notwithstanding, we've got some work to do to prove the data integrity, to prove that these innovative approaches are supporting and absolutely confirming patient safety. I think we will see some durability and sustainability of the innovation tactics deployed.
That's great. Well, one, very, very impressive work. And Matt, I think this is like an interesting tie-in to you. I know that TrialB announced like a patient recruitment tool that leverages real-world data. And one thing that we've heard again over the couple of days is the importance of the value, I guess, and insights that using data can provide biopharmaceutical companies that are trying to find where the patients are. So can you share with us some details about that effort and how that actually works in helping recruit patients into clinical trials?
Sure, Carter. So we launched a product called Hive earlier in this year, and it really does a lot of modeling based on real world data. And to understand the impact that can have, we have to look at, I think, traditional recruitment for clinical trials, which begins around a site and generally a relationship with that site. And so when we talk about diversity in clinical trials, it's really a matter of access today. Who has access to that site? Who's a part of that site? Who's nearby that site? And that really limits our ability to find a representative patient population, because we're dependent on this geographical boundary. And so Hive's really meant to get around all that and go directly to patients. I saw a stat this week, 70% of eligible patients for clinical trials live beyond 2 hours from a site or a clinic that's participating in the study. And so what that tells you right away is that the majority of eligible participants are not learning about the study by visiting their local clinic or site, or necessarily within the target geography around that site. And so that's where data comes in, and that's where the Hive product you're referring to comes into play. We look at medical records, we look at insurance claim data, we look at pharmacy data, and lately have, for rare disease and oncology in particular, have been looking at biomarker endpoints and lab data. And now it's all de-identified, But through programs like tokenization, through partners like Trinetics, who's on the call today, we're able to connect these disparate data sources and then do large modeling exercises to identify where those patients are so that we can target outreach to where the patients are, not necessarily where the sites. And decentralized clinical trials really sets up the scenario for less visits, more remote participation. And so when you drive down the barrier of access through decentralization of the trial, then you can increase awareness dramatically and really bring in that representative population. And it's so critical when we talk about diversity, because a lot of the diversity components we're after in our clinical trials are not near the sites. And so the availability of data, the ability to model around that data becomes really critical for finding the demographics that you need that really represent your patient population.
Well, that's a nice tee up for you, Malik, to talk about Trinetics' approach to using that data and transitioning that into working with biopharmaceutical companies to think about clinical trial site selection.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we were founded on the notion of moving away from static data, but really relying upon data and having that connectivity back to the site and ultimately back to the patient. And you know, every single data point that Trinetics collects today from 30 different countries, 200 plus million patients, connects back to a site and ultimately back to a patient. And so we give the power back to pharmaceutical companies and CROs to be able to identify patient cohorts that they're looking for, to go really, really deep in the kinds of patients that they're looking for, stratify, do all kinds of different analysis around the data, and to really then pinpoint which institutions have the kinds of patients that they're looking for, and then the ability to be able to reach out to those institutions, where those institutions can then re-identify each of those patients that were de-identified to the end user, but are re-identifiable to the hospitals themselves. And that's a really, really, really powerful thing to be able to pinpoint and find the right patient, because you're saving lots of time and energy, in addition finding the right patient for the right care. Now, in terms of the diversity of it is, you know, when you're able to harmonize and curate all of this data on a global basis, there's lots of different stratifications, there's lots of different things that you can do with the data. And that's really important, because you can try to, as Matt pointed out, the EMR will tell you, you know, are these patients within around the site, or are they an hour or two away? Or you can identify, do these patients need some sort of transportation? Do they need some sort of other kinds of accessibility? Do they need a caretaker to help them? So all these things are available within the power of data, and we can leverage the data to be able to then find those, you know, those unique kinds of patients that one, need the care, and two, that we'd love to be able to get into a trial.
And David, you know, you have like a decentralized trial platform. So again, as we've talked about, like using data to find the patients, you know, how does this all come to life, and like really thinking about setting up hybrid or decentralized trial approaches? What is your approach to that?
Sure, we use data and turn it into action. So if you take a look at, you know, typical, I guess the world population, only 8% of patients are ever contacted about joining a clinical trial. And so the key here is to make it available to everybody. So that's the 92% of the rest of the world, which is a huge percentage, obviously. And then, you know, cut it underneath there, and you know, there are populations that are not getting served. And you look at the people of color are being invited into clinical research at a third of the actual total population. Represents a real problem, not just from a societal perspective, but rather from you know, a commercial perspective when the drugs come to market on the real population. So it's extraordinarily important that we address those communities as part of clinical research. And when, you know, the Science 37 model is obviously an operating system to execute it, and that means that we can execute the full trial. We also can execute as what we call a meta site, or a virtual site that you set up to help operationalize that trial. So imagine you set up a network of sites around the world that'll get you to about 8% of that total population at most. And then Science 37 can come in and find the 92% of the rest of the population, including the diverse population. Because if you take a look at the data in terms of what we have within the patient communities that we've you know, captured to date on all of our trials, it looks just about like the total population. In fact, actually, it skews a little bit more diverse, because we've been asked to fill in some of the holes that are typical as it relates to a traditional clinical trial, which is all site-based. So finding the gap in our current or in the traditional trial structure is extraordinarily important, and we fill that void.
So, one thing that came up in one of our conversations yesterday, and again, part of the purpose of this summit really is to try to share insights and learnings and best practices, across the entire clinical research enterprise. And so what we kept hearing over and over again from the biopharmaceutical companies in particular was that it's really important to do this kind of analysis at the beginning, to really, there's steps even before we get into the data, mapping patient journeys, really thinking about the kind of data you need to collect. What's been are companies coming to you like early enough? Is that happening on a regular basis? Is that something we need to communicate, that if you're going to go about this data type of approach and try to stand up a decentralized trial approach, at what point should companies be coming and having these conversations with you all? And maybe I'll go around the, anybody who wants to jump into that, just jump in. Otherwise I'll call on some people.
Yeah, I can start. It's ideal you start at the point of protocol development, because then you're actually thinking, not just about the data, but also the infrastructure and how you want to go identify and then address those patients. And again, if you're stuck just with a site-based network and executing it a traditional way, your protocol would read one way. If you want to extend the ability to go get the patients that are outside of that 8%, then you have to address that in your protocol. So it's totally ideal that you get that at the protocol development stage. We've gotten ourselves into rescue modes quite significantly, and in those cases, then what happens is that we've got to go back and do a protocol change, and while doable, it's just a little bit of a hassle. And so the smart money is on doing it up front.
Other comments?
Yeah, I'll just maybe I'll take a shot at it. I think it's important to have a partnership in place inside of an institution. What we've really tried to focus on is giving operations a voice at the table. It's too often that protocols are developed within a silo. You're using prior art. You're using some subject matter experts to be able to design something that results in patients not being eligible, to ultimately resulting in amendments, resulting in, as Dave mentioned, wanting to then rescue a study based on changes that you need to make. But having operations leveraging data and giving them a voice to say, we shouldn't do this. We should expand this criteria. We should remove this criteria early on in the process, I think makes for a better overall experience and just a faster trial process.
And we know that that's an effective way to ensure that we have greater representation in the trials. Janssen in particular has been quite vocal about the ways in which they integrated real world data in their upfront for their vaccine trials, and then ended up with the most representative population they had ever seen in one of their trials. And so partnering upfront to understand that, and then also to get a better to contextualize what it is that we're targeting is very important.
I like to say, we're all familiar with the expression quality by design. This is diversity and inclusion by design. And it really is the red ribbon that runs through everything we do. And clearly protocol development and early engagement is the key best practice, but it's also being very forward looking and contemplating the so what behind who are the right sites, using past performance metrics and even current treatment in terms of are they treating current diverse populations? For instance, identifying within that plan of site management, how do we communicate and ensure that the sites appreciate and understand what their requirements are? And of course, operationally, as mentioned, making sure our CRAs and clinical leads are well trained and aware in how to communicate, and bringing in, as Janssen did so well, the grassroots community play, which we cannot underestimate that importance in partnering in the communities.
And Carter, I'll just add, I think it's really important to add a goal before you start recruiting patients into a study, and to really understand what is your representative patient population and set targets for your recruitment efforts that can be monitored on some frequency. And that's another way of looking at data, not real world data, but data of your enrollment, and adjusting along the way. Because if you set the target in advance and then you monitor it on a regular basis, you're much more likely to get closer to the final diversity cohort that you're looking for.
That's really, these are all very helpful insights. And Carolyn, I know that Ation partnered with FDA to assess and analyze the use of real world data. And again, I think that was to glean insights about treatments for COVID. But are there any learnings from that? Like did it advance our thinking, advance the collective thinking, if you will, about how to utilize real world evidence?
Absolutely. So you're right. In May of last year, FDA chose to use our platform for research collaboration specific to how to use real world data to better understand and respond to COVID-19. And, we're primarily focused on safety and effectiveness of COVID-19 interventions, and then informing FDA standards for RWE generation, which of course has implications beyond COVID. So we were relying on a product that we'd created, Real-Time Insights and Evidence, and we actually published some of the results of that on a bi-weekly basis. We're still doing this, sharing a graphic on our website every couple of weeks, showing trends and treatments for COVID, which provided important insights in understanding what was happening where. Much of what we have done in our ongoing collaboration with FDA relates to developing mechanisms to assess data fitness for use in these contexts and to optimize analytic approaches. We worked with them to ensure we had data that were fit for purpose and truly provided a longitudinal view across linked claims, labs, hospital charge master, EHR sources. These are the kinds of things that help them understand how to assess when data are fit for purpose and what to do when there's missingness in that underlying data, or how to address some of the gaps that we might find. And then we also use the data to contextualize what was happening with COVID, on a daily, weekly basis, so that we could start to understand the foundation for how analytics could address the critical and emergent public health questions as they evolved, because of course they were changing as we went. So we have actually started to share some of our findings. The FDA Science Forum is an example, and we have publications and conference presentations forthcoming. What we do find is that in addition to some of the progress we made on articulating how and when data are fit for purpose, we've also helped to drive understanding of the methodology, the scientific rigor that's necessary to create evidence that feels credible in these different contexts. And then we help to advance that in collaboration with IQVIA, with Trinetics and others who participated together with FDA and the Reagan-Udall Foundation, Friends of Cancer Research, and the Evidence Accelerator. And that was a great way to get the whole industry some of our approaches to the methodology, and then how we could create alignment industry-wide on what these global standards should be for turning data into evidence and making decisions off of them.
So not to give like the other panelists an opportunity to also continue along that thread, one thing I think that we've all heard, at the onset of the discussions that I think for me probably started in earnest 6 or more years ago, about the utilization of real world data to provide evidence that can impact regulatory decision making. And one of the hesitancy around that has been the quality of data and how to ensure that the quality, is meets the standards for making evidentiary based decisions, right? And so I'd love to hear, Malik or Matt or Cynthia, any of you that like to share with the audience about how we're continue to advance and improve that, and how this might look moving forward.
I mean, I'll start off from a perspective of finding patients using real world data. Let's just look at that lens, because that's where I spend a lot of my time. We use it to model. And so in our case, it's about finding disease prevalency, where that prevalency is at, and how to best reach those people who have that disease state. And so we tend not to, I guess, quality of data, when you're modeling large amounts of data, the quality of any in particular record becomes less critical. I think it's probably a more maybe relevant discussion as you get into data collection, but certainly in terms of modeling for finding patient prevalency and determining the best ways to reach patients, we've not had any concerns around data quality with real world data.
I'm so glad you made that distinction. Yeah, I probably slid into my day job of worrying about benefit risk a lot, but that's a really important distinction. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, happy to. You know, quality is the data and the insights of the data is only as good as the quality of the data, right? And so we spend a considerable amount of time, because you imagine gathering data from all over the world and mapping it to sort of a common terminology to ensuring that all the data lines up and that you can harmonize it and you can, you know, make evidence out of it in a very succinct way is really, really hard. And so to ensuring that all codes line up, to ensure that you know, a lab test at a particular institution lines up with a lab test at a different institution is super important, and all the things that sort of go into making the sausage is really important, because without that, you know, you're going to find, you know, the wrong kinds of patients. You're going to do misalignment in terms of the research that you're conducting, and so ensuring, you know, that the data is of high quality and what you're collecting. You know, it is real world data. It is supposed to be dirty data. You're not supposed to be able to. It's not supposed to be prescriptive like it is in a clinical trial. And so, but making sure that it's clean and usable is hyper important.
I certainly don't want to drone on, but just to, on this whole data integrity component, important to also note that, you know, our industry is actually a bit upside down in the healthcare arena. And what I mean by that is, you know, the 80% of our costs associated with data curation, associated with data curation, data linkage, and ensuring, if you will, that data quality. And only 20% of our costs are being pointed toward the actual, if you will, deriving insights and meaningful value out of those data sets. And so clearly, just underscoring what the panelists are highlighting here, that having data completeness, the longitudinality of data, that is so critically important. A little bit of only certain types of data, RX only, claims only, EMR only, it truly, to derive that high quality and inferential insights, it requires complete longitudinality of patient data to ensure that the correct and proper inference is being derived. And quite frankly, someone mentioned it previously, the actionable connected intelligence is actually the so what behind it all. You know, and what are the use cases associated with those high data integrity, you know, high quality filled data sets?
Important things in that regard, to build on what Cindy shared, is the transparency. So to the extent, example, maybe we're using a common data model. Well, how did the raw data translate into this common data model? If we're leaving the format, like Malik said, real world data is messy. We appreciate that and we understand why. Just being really transparent about what is missing, being transparent about what we did to address what we see to augment the quality, and then potentially even creating feedback loops to address with physicians or clinicians when we see gaps that we really need to address.
So I wanted to switch gears just slightly from the data, but even just to what is a decentralized trial. I will say, you know, at Bio, we're talking to a lot of our member companies, and I think we're even like, you know, we always have vernacular and lexicon and definitions, and really what we're learning in decentralized trials, it's really just looking at the complete toolbox of capabilities and figuring out how to deploy them most effectively to best ensure that you have a representative trial that is inclusive and representative of the disease you're trying to treat. So David, you know, when I say those words, you know, can you describe for the audience, like, what is a decentralized trial? What does that actually mean in terms, from a patient perspective? Like, how is it different maybe than the traditional trial approaches?
Yeah, I mean, I think by the original definition here of decentralized clinical trials was that you engage the patient from the comfort of their own home, rather than forcing them to travel to, you know, to a local site. The average patient travels 26 miles to make their visit, by the way, today. It's extraordinary. And so you take that burden away from them, and enable them to participate from the comfort of their own home, that it makes a big difference. We have cases where we're deploying nurses to go in home to actually get their cancer treatments, and we've had nurses dancing with the patients dancing with the nurses just because they're so excited that they have are unburdened from having that that trip that they have to make. And so I think that it really originated with that idea. I think the market's evolving a little bit though, and so I'm going to talk about that maybe a little bit later. But the ability to not just do the procedure from the comfort of their own home, but if there's more complexity that's required, living in a world where you can find the patient, enroll the patient from the comfort of their own home, and if there are procedures that actually have to happen, instead of limiting your universe to the 5% of all providers that are investigators today, which is part of the diversity issue that we're having in clinical research, you find the patients first, and then you send them to a local facility in order to get that procedure done. And so it doesn't work 100% of the time depending on the protocol, but by opening up the aperture and thinking about providers as participants in clinical research and enabling providers to offer clinical research as a care option is extraordinarily important as we think about the future of clinical research, and decentralization enables that.
So, and I'd love to hear others on the panel really talk about this, because one thing that we've heard, I would put this in the context of historical, what people identified historically as barriers, right? And I think we're in an action mode now, so I think we're in a solution-driven mode. But historically, I think what I would hear on occasion is, if you have a decentralized trial approach, or you have like a clinical trial where you train new clinical trialists in different facilities, then sometimes that goes away, and then that relationship with that physician is broken, and it's sporadic, and so you're not really building a sustainable and consistent, more expansive infrastructure. So collectively with your companies, Cynthia, David, Matt, Malik in particular, how can we view this from what do we need to do to create a more expansive infrastructure, that's more constant?
I love that question, Carter, because I think this panel is a great example. Like, had it not been for the technology infrastructure we have available and the fact that we're largely remote, you and I may not have connected, more than likely would not have, and we wouldn't be here talking about this topic today. And I don't think it's that much different with the patient. Meeting them where they are is where the relationship is going to happen in the future. It may not be 100% there today, but that's where it's going to be. It's going to be meeting the patient where they are, not where the physician is. And so I think you bring up a great point. And I think we're seeing a huge technology shift, probably accelerated by the pandemic, where we're coming to the patient really for the first time in history in a significant way, and then giving the tools that allow that connection. It's not as good as in person. I'd rather be with you and David and Cindy and Carolyn, and I'd rather be in person sitting around a room on a stage, and we could go out for a drink afterwards. And we can't do that yet. But this works quite well. And we can educate vast amounts of people through this format the same way a single physician, not bound by running from room to room, can do through televisits a significant amount of patient touch points. And then the in-person becomes more meaningful at more infrequent paces. I think it's a fantastic question you're asking, and would love to hear from the others.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
Yeah, I do think that interoperable digital technology is going to help us connect the healthcare ecosystem. I think we're all marching toward a vision that, and Dave, you mentioned it earlier, when we're able to leverage and converge clinical care with clinical research, we will know we have arrived. And this is the Holy Grail that I think we're all after, of how do we integrate resources, processes, technologies in such a way that we can fully leverage these physicians that wish to participate in clinical research, but it doesn't interrupt or interfere with clinical care. And in fact, the focus that we're all on here, and that the pandemic brought about the partnering at an all-time level, and I'm encouraged by that in the industry, how we are, really coming together. And I think that as we start connecting some of these digital capabilities with more research naive physicians in communities of interest that have the diverse communities, that we can actually be able to showcase where those referred patients are in their journey through the clinical trial, providing more transparency, more visibility, and, of course, the ability to crawl, walk, run into clinical research in a way that makes it more frictionless through the use of these decentralized approaches, direct-to-patient approaches, and quite frankly, the growing in the emerging healthcare ecosystem, and we all see it, big technology, pharmacy networks, healthcare networks, it's coming. And so it behooves us all to, contemplate how do we API into this ecosystem in a way that serves our patients better.
Yeah, we use the term democratization. So we talk about that in terms of the patient, enabling them universal access. So you don't have to live around that 5% of the sites that are out there today. You could live anywhere. But then also democratizing it from a provider standpoint. So you don't have to be the 5% that are, that create a huge infrastructure underneath in order to be able to manage clinical research. Bringing clinical research to the provider, bringing the clinical research to the patient is a complete different change in the paradigm, which is, it's enabled us from a recruitment standpoint to be able to, recruit patients, up to 15 times faster than what's being done through side-by-side site-based networks. In fact, actually, when we compare what we're doing across all of our studies where we have side-by-side comparison, the decentralized approach is beating the traditional approach every single time.
So,
Maybe just
go ahead, Malik. No, go ahead, Malik. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that there is. I think we're getting a lot better. I think there is education that's required, to the caregivers, that why this is such a good option, for their patients and for themselves as well if they want to be involved in these kinds of activities. That it's interesting if you look at the biopharma world, we spend 2x the amount of money commercializing a drug and spending all kinds of resources talking to physicians about why this particular therapy on a finite amount of data is so good for their patients, or we could spend an unlimited amount of data that we have, convincing and talking to physicians on why these, the patients that they have would be good for certain kinds of therapies. And so really kind of flipping the model on its head and leveraging data to be able to talk to the physicians on why, clinical research as a care option is such an important initiative.
I'm almost viewing this as a call to action for you all as leaders of CROs, tech data, analytic companies, as well as the biopharmaceutical companies to really kind of come together on that educational piece, right? It really is making sure that we're speaking the same language in the same way with the same desired outcome of a better understanding of the approaches and the benefits to not just the physician community and the biopharmaceutical community, but the patient community, to really explain what we're working to achieve, what that goal is, Cynthia, as you say, what is the map forward, what is our North Star, and make sure that we're bringing everybody along in a way that they can see value from their own perspective, of utilizing these new approaches. Does that resonate with everyone? Does that make sense?
And I think, that goes hand in glove with increased awareness of clinical trials and getting more deliberate about surfacing. Of course, clinicaltrials.gov, it's the one single point of contact, but quite candidly, we've got to do a better approach, even with the education and awareness building of community-based physicians relative to clinical trial access and communication with their patient.
And you just hit on something else, Cindy, that I wanted to bring forward to the audience. What we've talked about again over the past couple of days with other panelists is there's really, when you think about building a sustainable and more inclusive clinical development ecosystem, you really have a couple of goals, but I'll name two of them. that are different. They're related, but they're different. And one is just creating a more inclusive ecosystem, full stop. And then the second goal, related, but again, slightly different, is how do we improve our understanding of health outcomes across all patient populations by which you're treat, within a disease, that are suffering from a disease. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts, on how we should think about that before, in designing a trial, but also maybe how we can utilize some of this data. Carolyn, this might be for you in particular, utilize real world evidence to continue to expand our knowledge of those health outcomes. So maybe I'll start with you, Carolyn, and then we'll others feel free to jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what we have found is that there's value of using data, as we talked about from the upfront protocol development. One important stat to understand is that even for drugs, it just conventional wisdom once upon a time was that you use real world data for safety studies. Drugs been on the market, that's what we use it to analyze. In recent years, we've seen that change for really good reasons. In 2019, 49% of FDA's approvals included real world data in the submissions. Last year, these are for new drug approvals, this last year it jumped to 78%. So it just tells you the criticality of having data to inform understanding about effectiveness, and also to understand where they're, to contextualize what's happening, even in those early phases of the approvals. Certainly we talked before about linking data to get a more complete picture of outcomes and to really get a sense of even how, as we move forward as an industry, how patients define outcomes and how they're measuring quality. So we certainly try to take all of these things into account and get more robust views of what our patients are experiencing, and then try to be as consistent as possible in tracking and looking at what happens over time to ensure that we're able to see the long-term effects of medications that people are taking.
Anybody else want to kind of weigh in on that? I think it'd be interesting, not to name names, but, just to even get a sense of, how companies are approaching you all, and setting either representation goals and or inclusivity goals. And again, they may be different, right? What's the general sense, and is that changing and evolving?
Yeah, I definitely can affirm that it is changing and evolving. And I think, beginning with that early engagement, I think, science and epidemiology of the incidence and prevalence within diverse communities of disease states, that's critically important. I don't think that can be underscored enough. So beginning on that front, and then being able to leverage, as Carolyn stated, the ability to access and leverage real world data and other publicly available data. Again, this whole secret sauce of integrating the right and triangulating the right data sets. So for instance, in our COVID pandemic approach, getting to the right diverse populations, we actually triangulated our real world evidence around the globe with publicly available data sets that included lifestyle, behavioral, consumer data, and being able to actually target and using multi or omni-channeled approaches, because in some instances, real world data will not reflect the actual, especially, in underserved communities or in disease states that are very rare and small. They may not even be within the real world claims data, EMR, et cetera. So we've got to go not only where the patients are, but we've got to use the omni channels that actually can reach. So we partnered, for instance, with telecommunication partners, big B2C companies, being able, and even social media, being able to reach that right targeted population, and being able to use and even getting feedback on the right messaging, the right language. How did they respond to our patient recruitment advertisements, et cetera? And then being able to properly, digitally, seamlessly chatbot and screen them and trial match them to the right sites within 5 miles to where they're where they resided. So these are all the ways to actually get to these targeted channels.
Yeah, and just maybe a quick comment. I think Matt and Carolyn mentioned linking. And we see that as while the technology has been around for a long time. The usability in clinical research is really starting to become pronounced. And if you think about COVID, and I think it's a bit of a miss probably on the industry to not link patients that were in clinical trials for the COVID vaccine, because it would be great to see, hey, these 30,000 patients that were in a trial, what's happening to them now after 6 months, 9 months, a year after they've had the experimental vaccine? What other kinds of comorbidities or other issues that they may be seeing? And so I think as we move forward as an industry, being able to link patients within a clinical trial and then being able to follow them, and as Cindy mentioned, applying different kinds of data, not just claims data, but other kinds of social data to really understand and then use that feedback loop into the research process, I think will be very critical in terms of how we even design clinical trials.
Slightly differently, but the idea of enabling patients to ensure that they're getting the information back, after their clinical trial, but as well as maybe providing them opportunities to discuss their experiences, again, maybe not in a data-driven way, but just generally speaking in an educational sort of way, was a concept that was raised a couple of times yesterday. So that's really interesting to think about it from both perspectives.
I think about the recent Biogen news and the Alzheimer's drug, and how great would it be, maybe they did, to tokenize that data from the clinical trial and follow it into the real world and follow the participants' data path and understand, how treatment goes beyond the clinical trial. So Malik and Carter, you're spot on with your comments around linkage of data.
So Matt and David, maybe I'd ask you a question, and then anybody can feel free to jump in. But one thing that we've also heard is, again, there was a lot of discussions throughout the previous panels about the importance of finding the patient and how data can help people find the patient. I'd like to hear your thoughts on but what's the turn to actually recruiting the patient? So you find the patient. What are you all doing, and how are you working with companies and community leaders to turn that sort of data find to an actual action of enrollment? And maybe I'll start with you, Matt.
Sure. Yeah. It's not just about finding, it's about, kind of reaching them and where they're at. And, every disease has a different motivation factor. And so it's not just enough to reach them and where they're at. You really have to understand the profile of who they are as a patient. And that changes male, female, it changes African American, white, Hispanic. Really having robust profiles for how you're targeting patients is critical, in addition to just using the data to understand where they're at. And I think it's about understanding their journey into the study from that point forward, when they say, yeah, I want to learn more. What you're offering, what you're talking about resonates exactly with how I feel. And so that journey in is two pieces from our standpoint. It's the patient-centric piece, which is making it seamless for them, giving them telehealth as quickly as possible, because it's very likely they're not going to see a physician for a while. So giving them telehealth as quickly as possible in that flow, doing more than just asking them some online questions, but actually engaging them with a live person before they're referred into a site. I think that patient experience is really critical. If we can grab their medical record along the way and help them be more study ready, that's what I'll call the patient-centric piece. But underneath that, and this is where we at TrialB personally believe we can move the needle on patient recruitment, is the analytics. And Cindy nailed it with, there's multiple channels that you're reaching people through. There's social media. There's still print and news channels. You have doctors and physician channels. You have different aspects of online communities and Facebook channels and Google search channels. All these channels that we're reaching patients through. It's the analytics of understanding the outcomes for any given trial that those channels are generating, and figuring out how to adaptively recruit so that you're putting spend into the channels that are producing the right outcomes, whether that outcome is a diversity outcome or whether it's simply a quantity of patients at a particular site or geography. I think this is where analytics and data play an even more significant part in the process. And it's analyzing the channels of patients and what outcomes they're driving so that you could adaptively go after the channels that have the right outcomes for your study. And so that's kind of my long-winded answer to your question.
That's a great answer. Others want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I love the answer, and I love where you went in terms of the behaviors ultimately, and who the individuals are and how they're going to react. And I mean, shoot, we've got a trial where we have a lot of diverse patients that we have to enroll from several different ethnic groups, and we got down to executing by finding patients in bowling alleys and in barbershops at some point to pull them into a clinical trial. But there is the connection between, especially to some of the underserved populations, about trust, right? Of trust to the investigator, of trust to about clinical research in general, and so matching the patient with an investigator who might be of the same community is also important too. So as we think about setting up a provider network and making sure that you have to make sure that your provider network also has the same ethnic distribution as your patient network. So one of the things that we did in the we just raised some funds, and we also started something called the Diversity in Clinical Research Foundation. And so that foundation is developed purely to provide grants to organizations who are having unique approaches to go finding both patients and investigators of communities of color, so that we can increase participation amongst those communities. And so the more that we all can do, I think that will benefit. And I realize some of this is some companies will draft off of the work that we're doing there and the grants that we're doing there, but it's all for the greater good, because we're all trying to solve the same problem.
Well, that kind of gets to the infrastructure question as well, right? You're trying, where you're building like a stable of researchers and trialists and things like that in a more sustainable way. I also wanted to, it occurs to a couple of comments, Matt, that you and David raised. And that is, when we talk about best practices, as bio, as an organization that represents, hundreds and hundreds of biopharmaceutical companies, we are trying to figure out how we share learnings, right? So we're not keep rebuilding the same mountain, right? And in the previous panel, there was a couple of leaders from Gilead and Eli Lilly that were really talking about how they are thinking about defining the patient journey. And so we talked earlier about like how companies should get engaged with you all early at protocol development, but we're kind of raising another important point here, and that is, even before protocol development, have you really thought about all the patients' unique journeys that you are trying to reach and engage with? Is that a fair point? And I think it'd be great for us to somehow make sure we stay in touch, come back together, and really figure out how we can share those learnings, across the ecosystem. Does that make sense?
Completely.
I have all your numbers now, so
yeah. Well, Carter, I completely appreciate that this is going to be a team sport. And it's going to be, it's going to take a village to actually conquer some of these challenges that you've highlighted. And I think that no doubt, from a diversity and inclusion point of view, in getting after, the ability to together collectively build these alliances, build these site networks. But then, of course, individually, companies will likewise be able to do that, if you will, interoperable connectivity that we talked about. So taking a naive or a more research inexperienced community site, geo-mapping them with all of our respective tools, right? We know who these savvy investigators are, and geo-mapping in a way that we can digitally connect and helping to foster and engender, a more comprehensive, holistic approach across the healthcare ecosystem. And I would just say, we also, what we didn't talk about today, which is so critically important, is scale and globality. Of course, US is important, but we cannot fail to be reminded that the lion's share of our trials are indeed global.
to really understand too is that, you know, the data that we're using for research purposes or that we're accessing in these contexts often reflect the bias and inequity that's inherent in the broader health system. And, you know, this is especially true for rare diseases, when a patient has to get to a specialist, as an example, or an academic medical center, and that takes resources and awareness and other things that we don't necessarily find to be equitable across different patient populations. And so even as we're evaluating these data, we have to understand what we're looking at and whether there are systemic, and to your point about infrastructure, there's more infrastructure that we need to invest in order to address it.
So Caroline, should we be thinking about how we utilize data to uncover those biases, or do we need to be equally, and maybe this is an and or do we need to think about, again, are we collecting data in a way that is less biased?
We absolutely have to do both. And the first thing we have to do, Carter, is be aware. And I think, you know, we have so much data at our fingertips today. And, you know, we've talked about linking and tokenization, and that is all very important. And we're working on these kinds of things with our customers. We capture so much in claims. We capture so much from our everyday interactions already with patients. And so it's really critical to us to access that in a more systematic way and start by understanding what we have today. And then to your point, certainly the biases in the way we collect data, and then also what might be inherent in the system. But I would say it has to be parallel tracked.
That's a really interesting point. So I'm going to move to the audience questions here in just a moment. But before we do that, I do want to raise one point that that's been raised in a couple of conversations, and particularly, I think, you know, Cindy, when you're thinking about this globally, I think this becomes an even bigger question, and that is, as we launch forward with all these new ways of doing things, how do we make sure we're not creating another divide, you know, by a digital divide? You know, how are you all thinking through that? How should we be thinking through that? And maybe I'll let everybody answer that question if they like. Anybody want to go first?
Happy to. I think that you're again, that was precisely the intent of my comment, that as we are spinning up the decentralized trials, direct to patient digital capabilities in the interoperability in orchestration in a very frictionless manner for both investigators as well as patients, and quite frankly, sponsors and CROs alike, and thinking about how there will be country nuances, and especially direct to patient, you know, where there may not be the permissibility or the requirements may vary country to country, but trying to ensure the interoperability orchestration of technology in a way that's intuitive as well. Again, it's all about being, you know, reducing the burden, single sign-on, and being able to connect in with the other clinical trial tech applications in a way that makes it very seamless and, you know, industrialized, scalable.
And also being very aware of which data are fit for purpose and what those data represent. So for example, if I were doing lung cancer, I would want to look at, you know, Flatiron, of course, Ontada, Concert AI. I'd also want to make sure I had PsyOps in the mix. So I'm getting the academic facilities, I'm getting community clinics, I'm getting that diverse representation. And sometimes that requires meta-analyses. So I'm doing the same analysis in multiple data sets to get that complete picture. But those are the kinds of things that we need to understand so that we don't repeat the inequities that exist in the underlying way that we practice medicine.
I think you approached that question originally with the digital divide, and so you have to think about that, I think, in two constructs. The first of which is the equipment that they might need in order to be able to do a trial. So you know, think about, again, you got to start with the patient first. You know, you can't execute a trial where you're using an iPhone. You have to have the flexibility in order to provision any sort of device and actually be able to get the device into the hands of the individual, and you know, without them having to spend a fortune in order to get it. And so there's sort of the financial divide, and then there's more of the workflow divide, which is, you know, can you actually execute it? Now, you know, I've got a 78-year-old mother-in-law who's you has early form of Alzheimer's. She actually can use an iPhone and an iPad, but the workflow of whatever you put together, assuming you're making the patient do activities, it's got to be extraordinarily simple, so that anybody can do it. And so the key there is to really put yourself inside the patient's mind and be able to execute from there forward.
Yeah, I agree with Dave. I mean, it's 10 years ago, you had 30% of the population over the age of 13 that had a cell phone, and today it's like 85%. And so, everybody has a phone, but we fixed a problem and created another problem, right? It's we've made it too confusing. We've presented way too much information out there that people tend to just sort of ignore a lot of the noise. I mean, I don't answer the phone if I don't know the number today. And so it's, so education is super critical. And even in, outside the US, we're starting to see, really appreciable numbers of people having access to technology. But again, what do they do with the technology? So again, making it simple, showing them how to use it, how they can use it for their own benefit and their own healthcare is super important.
Carter, well, first of all, now I know why my calls of link go to voicemail. But just kidding. One of the interesting areas I think that can help a lot here, and Bio is uniquely suited to help, is partnering with Congress in the U.S. and with bodies across the world. Like this week, I was on the phone with I'm from Delaware, right? And so one of our congresswomen has put forth a bill in Congress to support diversity in Alzheimer's research, and it's got a $60 million grant attached to it. And the concept is to work through the I can't remember the acronym, the Institute of Aging, and increase the number of research sites participating in Alzheimer's, and specifically target areas that aren't participating today and would be lower income, and try and drive up more diverse participation in Alzheimer's research. And I think there's probably a lot of interest in our legislative communities to try and bring forth grants that can help this. And Bio, who's better suited than Bio to participate and connect into some of that? Because I think you guys really are the global organization. And so I would just like to bring in that additional aspect of looking at our legislative systems and seeing if there's a way to partner with them better to direct government funding into this problem, which it is a problem, diversity in clinical research.
I really appreciate you bringing that up. And we are a policy and advocacy organization, and Congress is very interested in working, with us, with patient organizations, with community leaders. So again, I think the good news is people are in action mode, and we do expect to make progress. I will say, I will quote what the chair of Bio's board, Ted Love, who's CEO of Global Blood Therapeutics, said. I asked him, I was like, well, if we have this conversation 5 years from now, what do you want to talk about? And he's like, I don't want to be talking about this. This should be resolved. And I think that's the goal. And I think that's what we're driving towards. All right. Well, I'm going to go to the audience questions, make sure I get a couple of their questions in as well. We have one here that talks about, and I think this is a pivot of something you raised, Matt, at the top of the discussion. And that is when when you think about a company monitoring the progress of meeting targets, what has to be done to sort of, if they're not meeting the target, how do companies interact with y'all to right this ship, if those targets aren't being met?
Yeah. So I'll kind of look at how patient recruitment's traditionally done today, and I'm just going to look at this, what's called centralized patient recruitment, not what the site does within their own network of patients, but which generally companies like TrialB come in to do. And in a typical study today, in TrialB's case, you bring in TrialB, we will target multiple channels that we think find the patients. And so let's say there's 5 channels. There's Google search, and there's Facebook, and then there's Outbrain, and there's Taboola platforms, and there's all these known digital platforms to find patients. And sometimes they're more traditional. And then in addition to TrialB, because patient recruitment has not been moved needle-wise in so many years, companies will hire another patient recruitment company and another patient recruitment company, and they have their own channels. And so you could be looking in a given clinical trial, you're recruiting and spending money out in the world across 15 or 20 different channels. And where analytics and data come into play, and coming back to the question, what can be done? This is where, we're working on a platform that looks across every channel and what is the spend and what is the outcome in terms of randomizations, in terms of the number of randomizations, in terms of the diversity ratios coming from those channels, and then providing recommendations back that say, stop spending here. Either these channels aren't producing randomizations, the vendors aren't producing randomizations, the sites aren't consuming the referrals. And so it looks at both sides of that, because not every site wants to participate in centralized recruitment, but spend more here in these channels, which are producing the right outcomes, whether it be diversity or whether it be just plain randomizations. And so when you look at what can be done, is looking on a frequent basis. I always recommend clients, at least monthly, but ideally weekly, what's going on in those channels that you're spending across, and start trimming out the ones that aren't producing and start diverting that spend in the channels that are, and you'll get there faster. And if you have a target you're hitting for, you can monitor that specific target, and you can get, you can't always get it exactly, because diversity is a multi-phased problem. It's not just about finding people, but you can get pretty close.
And David, I think you called it like the rescue mission, right? That you've had to come in and do some rescue operations. I believe that's what I heard you say earlier. I didn't know if you wanted to comment on it as well.
I mean, I think that Matt nailed it. I think that different channels have different levels of productivity, and rescues that we're typically doing are something that was a site-based study and that just hadn't worked out, and they're desperate and looking for a different way of doing things, and so we jump on it, and it's a totally different way of executing, right? So it's I keep on going back to it. You're stuck with the traditional 8% if you're stuck with a site-only kind of solution. So it's a completely different way of executing, and it fresh patient pools that you would never be able to get to ever in the past.
Just underscore Matt's commentary about the importance of being able to connect the digital omni-channel-like approach to workflow, and that in that closed environment, being able to track real time. And Matt brought a smile to my face, because actually we were doing this hourly on COVID, every 4 hours, actually looking at the channels and identifying which channels in which countries had the best yields. And in fact, specifically for diversity. I can't underscore enough the importance of the ability to integrate into workflow and to have reporting and analytics capability in order to pull that off effectively.
That's really, this is so, I knew I was going to learn a lot from this panel, but I think this is so interesting for our audience to really think about, again, how they need to be operationalizing themselves in their engagements with companies like yours. Another important question that came through the audience that we didn't get to during our panel discussion, and that is sort of the question about challenges that may be slightly unique or different between trying to get diversity and inclusivity for a rare disease population versus a highly prevalent population. And I think I'd really like to hear about how you guys been approaching ensuring inclusivity and diversity for smaller data sets. How are you thinking through those issues? Anybody want to take that one on?
Yeah, I'm happy to start.
Okay.
Yeah, we again with a global platform with access to 200 million patients. How you manipulate the data, understand how how you can triage the data is super important. We just actually ran a webinar on this very point of really being able to find diverse populations. Patients that may need a wheelchair, patients that may need an assistance from a family member, patients that as I mentioned earlier are too far away from a site. Patients, there's a parent-child relationship. All those different factors can be found in the data, and how you can ultimately tease that out to be able to find those rare patients or those diverse populations. It's there at our fingertips. I think it's learning how to use it and be able to access the data. It's accessible.
Yeah, and in rare disease, we have to be thoughtful about using things like external control arms as an example. So using data to, some people call them synthetic controls, but using data to provide that insight because it's unethical or simply not feasible to recruit or to either unethical to not give people access to what could be their life-saving drug, or it's just not feasible to recruit enough people to participate in the trials. And so one of the things that we try to do is think about the ways we can apply advances in scientific methodology to give us the confidence that things like ECAs are appropriate, and to understand how and when we can create them in a credible way, and then where maybe we don't have the data that we need and we have to get more creative.
Appreciate that. So here's another really interesting question, and I'm so glad somebody asked it. So whoever did this, I appreciate it. And that is, like, in your all's collective experience, do we actually have data analysis that tells us whether or not a clinical trial site that is located within a community, within a particular currently underrepresented community, if we bring the trial there, are we actually more successful in enrolling those communities? Does that make sense?
I think there's a lot of data out there about that, and I would if I was trying to get at that data, I'd know right the partners I go to. I mean, you have Latinos in clinical research is a great example, and these guys are really looking at the data and the local problem. I think when it comes to finding, does it make a difference? From what I'm hearing, it absolutely does. I don't have the data at my fingertips, so maybe one of my esteemed colleagues here does. But I can tell you there is a high degree of trust when your physician is like you, and especially when you're in a diverse community. And I think that's true in African American, it's true in Hispanic, it's true across the number of nationalities.
Right. So one colleague wanted me to ask, can we talk about the feasibility of using blockchain technology to share data in drug development and patient care space? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
I mean, I'll just say that there's lots of uses of blockchain is just another form of analytics, and there's lots of different use cases of using, blockchain or AI or machine learning. All those different capabilities are out there. I think it's really interesting as these technologies evolve. I mean, we're doing it today to be able to find patients that that have early stage pancreatic cancer, that may not even know about it, but to be able to use different AI technologies to be able to do that, to be able to patient linking is a form of blockchain, to be able to then tag these patients and then have the visibility into them well into the future as well. Other kinds of analytic capability is, and this speaks to a lot of the diverse populations, is to find patients that haven't been diagnosed, and we can use those kinds of analytic capabilities to be able to find the attributes of those patients that have been diagnosed, and leverage those attributes on a very broader population to see what other kinds of patients that haven't been diagnosed that sort of matches attributes as well. So again, there's various types of different analytic capabilities that I think are still evolving, but all are very applicable to clinical research.
So I'd like to, we've only got a few more minutes, and I'd like to give everybody sort of their, each of you to give a parting thought, and maybe along the lines of, aspirational, and hopeful and optimistic, what is the future here? Like what we keep saying, we don't want to do things the way we've always done them. That is not going to affect the change that we want to bring forward in creating this sort of inclusive and representative ecosystem. So, I'd like to hear your visions and, like, what does the future hold? And what are we going to accomplish? Not what we hope to accomplish. Where are we going? Carolyn, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll speak to this in the context of real world data and real world evidence that, first and foremost in the future, we'll see that real world data is critical to informing decisions at every step of drug development, from the early stages to regulatory approvals and then commercialization, value-based care contracts with payers, everything in between. We'll more systematically use artificial intelligence to inform hypotheses generation. We'll use machine learning to apply sophisticated epidemiological methodology and to make it simpler for users to access these advances in methodology as they're doing these kinds of analyses. And then in general, we'll look to technology to help us bring a level of transparency and replicability that is absolutely critical to bringing trust between these disparate parties who maybe have different objectives. And all of this will happen in the context of informing global standards around how and when to look to data, when it's fit for purpose, and then what we expect real world evidence to meet in terms of how credible it is to drive these decisions.
Love that answer. Cindy, why don't you go next?
Very optimistic that, that time is certainly here. We've been talking about this for decades, a patient-focused drug development. And I think, we are now moving from developing products for patients and developing products with patients. And that is early engagement. And I think this is going to be brought to us via digitalization. Of course, using our real world evidence direct to patients, they come right into the center of everything that we do. And notwithstanding, taking a page out of Carolyn's book regarding real world evidence, we will see patients coming forward and provisioning their EMR records, data mediated sourcing. And that's going to be from a qualification from direct to patient recruitment all the way through the clinical trial process. And of course, within the confines of data privacy and ensuring, we are protecting patients and their data along the way. Very optimistic.
I love that we're developing with patients. I love that. Malik?
Yeah, I think, kudos should be given to everybody on this panel and to the industry, right? I mean, getting drugs approved with huge patient volumes in less than a year, it may have taken a pandemic to do it, but we all collaborated and did it together. And so, I want to see more of that, whether we use technology, data, people, systems, whatever. That should be the wave of the future. Why can't we get more drugs? Why does it take 7 to 10 years? We should use the same lessons learned that we have, with the COVID vaccines and apply it across the board to lots of other medications just to get them to the market faster. And I think that's, that's where I'm very hopeful of the future.
Great. Matt?
Yeah, so I would say from a data perspective, in my scope of world, which tends to be around the patient recruitment, as everyone knows, recommendation engines, I think will start to come into play, both all across the clinical spectrum, but in my world, recommending channels, as we talked about, and predictors, propensity to join a trial, predictors of enrollment end times based on different scenarios. I think you'll get to models that are seeing it through and not just at the front end.
That's really that sounds really exciting. And David, we'll leave to you to close us out here.
Yeah, with the goal of accelerating research here, ultimately we're talking about democratizing it. And so you're democratizing it for a patient, you're democratizing it for providers. You're going to have a world where you're going to have patients who are going to be working, participating from the comfort of their own home. You're going to have patients who are going to be going to the site. You're going to have permutations where they're going to go to a Walgreens or to a CVS or a local care facility in order to get procedures done. You're going to have providers who are managing patients that are going to be in the clinic and providers who are managing patients who are remote. And so if we want to achieve acceleration, we have to be able to have a system that navigates smoothly between an on-premise and an off-premise universe and elegantly and embrace it in order to gain the speed that we're all looking for.
Well, I think that is the perfect vision to end this call. And like I said, I knew I was going to learn a lot. I think you provided some really powerful insights for our audience. And I personally look forward to continuing to work with each of you as we, again, continue to collaborate and sort of hold hands to advance this new vision forward as a true ecosystem coming together. So thank you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Carter.